This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help getting started in Lesson 2 in the Academy's Latin Grammar 1 course. In Lesson 2 we're going to study two articles, articles number 2 and 3, and you can see on the screen here that the subject of this lesson will be vowels. So in Lesson 1 we learned about the Latin alphabet. We learned that there are 23 letters in the Latin alphabet, and we learned a few helpful notes about some of the differences between the English alphabet and the Latin alphabet and how the Latin alphabet changed over time. We learned that there are 23 letters, and those letters divide into vowels and consonants. In Lesson 2, we're going to study the vowels. So you can see here, the title of this section is Vowels, and we've got Article 2 and Article 3 down here. So in Article 2, we learn the names, or we identify the Latin vowels, and then in Article 3, we will discuss the sounds of the Latin vowels. So let's go ahead and get started with Lesson 2. This should be a pretty simple lesson, so let's just take a look and walk through it together. We learned that the vowels in Latin are, and these are the names of them, so just listen along: a, e, o, u, and upsilon. A, e, o, u, and upsilon. Now, upsilon is put in parentheses here because if you remember in Lesson 1, we learned that upsilon is really a Greek vowel. It's used in words that are brought into Latin from Greek. So really there are 5 Latin vowels: a, e, o, and u, and upsilon is really a Greek vowel that's brought into Latin. That's why it's set in parentheses here. So these are the Latin vowels. There are 5 or 6 depending on how you want to think about that. But these vowels are divided into a number of different groups. There are different kinds of vowels, and in these notes here, 1 and 2, we'll talk about the different groups of vowels. So out of 23 letters in the Latin alphabet, let's say there are 6 vowels, including upsilon, and they're divided according to their quality and according to their quantity. So they're divided into groups in 2 different ways. There's 2 different ways to divide the vowels into groups. The first way to divide them is according to their quality. The second way to divide them is according to their quantity or prolongation. So quality refers to the position of the organs used in pronunciation. That is, the way that our mouth actually works to pronounce these vowels. So we can group them according to how they're pronounced in our mouths. And the second way is by quantity, that is, whether the vowel is long or short in the time that it takes to pronounce it. So 2 different ways to divide the vowels into classes. The first by quality, which relates to how the sound is produced, and the second according to quantity, which has to do with how long in time the sound is produced. So let's look at this first division. If we divide the vowels according to quality, we see that there are 2 groups: guttural vowels and palatal vowels. Guttural and palatal. These 3 vowels, a, o, and u, are called guttural because we make the sound of these vowels in the back of our mouth, close to our throat, in the back of our mouth. So they're called guttural. And you can just feel this if you pronounce these sounds and pay attention to where you can feel the sound actually being produced. Ah, ah, ah. You can feel it back in your throat. Ah, ah, oh, oh. Again, you can feel that in the back of your mouth. Ooh, ooh, same place. Ah, oh, and ooh. They're all made in the back of the mouth, and you'll notice that the way you make the differences in the vowel sounds is by moving your lips in different shapes. Ah, o, oo, ah, o, oo. Practice that. You might need to look in a mirror to really see it, but you'll see that two things are going on. You're making sound in the back of your mouth, and you're changing the shape of your lips to form these different vowel sounds. But those vowels are called guttural vowels because they're made in the back of the mouth. Ah, o, and oo. The second group are called palatal vowels because they're made in the front of your mouth. The top of your mouth is called the palate. We call it the roof of the mouth. If you feel the top of your mouth with your tongue, you feel that hard roof of your mouth, that's called the palate. The second group of vowels are called palatal vowels because the sound is actually made further forward near the front of the mouth. If you practice saying these sounds, you'll feel where the sound is produced in your mouth. Let's practice. The first vowel here is e, 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 e. And if you repeat that and pay attention to where you feel the sound being produced, you'll see it's not produced in the same place as these other vowels. It's produced further forward in the front of your mouth. It's a palatal vowel. The second is E, E, E. Again, if you pronounce it, you'll feel it forward in the front of your mouth. And then lastly, we have the upsilon in parentheses here. And this is a difficult vowel to learn to pronounce because it really doesn't have a sound in English that we're used to. It's got its own sound. And I'll explain to you how to make this sound, and then I'll make it a few times so you can hear it. But it takes some practice. First of all, what you're going to do, remember this is a palatal vowel, so it's going to be made in the front of the mouth. What you're going to do to make this sound of this upsilon is round your lips, round your lips as if you're going to say oo, oo, oo. But then, in your mouth, with your lips still rounded, make the sound of E, E, E. So inside of our mouth, we're making the sound E, but with our lips, we're rounded as if we're going to make the sound oo. And now do both of those things together. Make the sound E with your lips tightly rounded. It will sound like this. Oo, oo, oo. Oo, oo, oo. Again, we don't have that sound in English, so it sometimes is difficult for young students to learn. But that's the sound of the upsilon. It's really not the oo sound. It's in between the oo and the E, sort of a combination of those two sounds. Oo, oo, oo. Now, that's why this letter is also called E Graika. E Graika, it means the Greek E, because it's like an E, but we round the lips. U, U, U. And again, you can feel that sound is made in the front of the mouth, on the palate. It's a palatal sound. So the first way to divide the vowels is by how they're produced in the mouth. Guttural vowels are produced in the back of the mouth, and palatal vowels are produced in the front of the mouth. Now, you don't need to memorize these because you can figure it out by simply pronouncing them. But you should learn the two names for these groups. Once you learn the names, if you know the names of the vowels and their sounds, you'll be able to figure out which is which by simply pronouncing them. But you should practice that. Make sure you can feel it. As the lesson says, you should feel it. Now, if you pronounce sounds and you feel it in a different place, that may be a sign that you're not pronouncing it correctly. So if the rule doesn't work for you, it may be a sign you need to fix things. If you run into a problem like that, you feel like something's wrong, you should post a question on the support forum on the course page, and I'll help you out with that. But the first rule here is we learn that the vowels can be divided according to their quality, how they're produced, into guttural vowels and palatal vowels. The second note here says we can also divide the vowels according to quantity, how long they are. We can divide them by quantity. All right, so there are long vowels and short vowels. Now, in English, this can be confusing because we use these names, long and short, in ways that don't make any sense. For example, we'll say that the A in the word face, A, we'll call that sound the long A, but it really has nothing to do with being long or short. It's a different sound. In Latin, we don't do that. In Latin, long means long in time. So for example, if I take the vowel ah, it's short if I say ah, ah, ah. It's long if I say ah, ah. So long and short in Latin literally means long in time and short in time. It doesn't have to do with different sounds of the vowels. There's only one sound for each vowel in Latin, but they can change in the length of the time that they're spoken. Okay, so the second way to group the vowels is by long and short. And we'll see exactly how these sound in Article 3. Note the remark underneath Article 2 here. Vowels whose quantity shifts in poetry are called common, and they are distinguished thus. And so you can see that there will be a mark over the vowel, which includes both the short symbol and the long symbol. That means that you can read it as short or long, but whichever symbol is on the bottom is the one you should try to stick with. By preference, this is short. And likewise, if you see a symbol like this where there's a long sign with a short sign on top of it, that means it can be pronounced either long or short, but you should try to pronounce it with a long sound. Now notice it also says in poetry, so this is not something you need to worry about right now. This will become important when you learn to read Latin poetry, if you learn to read Latin poetry, because Latin poetry, when you read it, it will have to fit into the rhythm of the line. So sometimes, to help the poets, they will change the quantity of a vowel in order to make it fit into their into the meter of the line of the poetry. And in poetry, poets have freedom to make changes where they really don't follow the rules of grammar for sentence writing. They're allowed to take a little freedom to change things in order to make it easier for them to keep the meter and the rhythm of their poetry. This is called poetic license. Poetic license means that poets, when they're trying to compose poetry, are given freedom in sort of bending the rules of grammar in order to help them write their poetry. Poetic license. So that's just a note there under Article 2, but remember, it only applies to poetry. And if you're not reading poetry, you don't have to worry about it. Let's get down to Article 3 here, the sounds of the vowels. The sounds of the vowels. Now, if you learn English spelling, you'll know that English is a very complicated language. One letter in English could represent 5 or 6 different sounds. But in Latin, that's never true. In Latin, a vowel, or I should say, in classical Latin, a vowel represents just one sound. So learning to read with Latin is very simple. Every vowel represents one sound. So let's look at the sounds of the vowels, which again are very easy to learn. The first letter we see here is the long. You can see the long sign over the ah, long ah. And this long ah makes the sound of ah in father. Notice that the length of the vowel is long. father, father. That's the long ah. Ah in father. Ah, ah, ah. Always ah. Next we have the long eh, eh, eh. And we see that this vowel is sounded with the eh sound in pray, pray, pray. And you can hear that is long. Eh, 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 pray. Long eh. Next we have E, and we see a long sign above it, E, E, as in caprice, caprice, E. We can also use the English word machine, machine, E. That's the sound of the long E in Latin. Next we have the O, a long O. It's like O in bone, O, 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 long O. Next we have oo. It's like oo in moon, oo, oo. And then finally we have the upsilon, and you can see that they write a note here. They can't give us a sound in English or a word in English to use as an example because the real sound of the upsilon doesn't exist in English. I explained this before, but here you have two examples given. A French word, because this sound does exist in French, and a German letter, because this sound does exist in German. And again, the sound of the upsilon, we make it by pronouncing the E sound inside of our mouths while rounding our lips, like we're going to say oo. And we do those two things together, and we make the sound oo, oo, oo. Take some practice. But that's the sound of the upsilon. So to review these quickly, we have a, e, o, u, u. Those are the sounds of the 6 Latin vowels. Now, it's very simple because there's no other sounds. What you've got to do, though, as a student, is you've got to practice reading every Latin word with these proper sounds. So it's a matter of discipline. You can't be lazy. You've got to practice proper pronunciation because you've been taught the rule for pronunciation. It's very simple, but you have to practice it. And if you don't practice it, it's just a matter of laziness, and you can't allow that to happen. Now, the other reason why it's very helpful to carefully practice classical Latin pronunciation is that it will help you with spelling. It will be very easy to spell Latin words if you practice pronouncing them correctly because each letter represents only one sound. So you can easily remember how to spell a Latin word if you learn to pronounce it carefully. So take the time to practice with the sounds of the vowels and discipline yourself to read Latin words slowly and make sure you get the pronunciation perfect. In a future lesson, we're going to get into the pronunciation of all the consonants, so we'll take care of that then. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about diphthongs, as you can see below in Article 4. So we'll learn how to read combinations of vowel sounds. But you've got to discipline yourself to read Latin words slowly and carefully, always practicing perfect pronunciation. Not only because it will help you just with reading and understanding the sound of the language, but because it will also help you to spell Latin words. So that's very important. Note the remark here at the bottom of Article 3. The short sounds are only less prolonged in pronunciation than the long sounds. So in this third article, we see all the vowel sounds, and we were given long vowel sounds, probably to help us hear the sound of them by pronouncing them for a longer time. But all that a short vowel is the same sound spoken in a shorter time. So instead of ah, it's just ah. Instead of it's eh. Instead of e, the long e, the short e will be I. The short o would be o. The short u would be u. and the short upsilon would be u. So it's just a matter of time. Long and short refers simply to time in Latin. And that brings us to the end of Article 3, which is the end of Lesson 2. So I hope that's a helpful guide through this second lesson in Latin Grammar 1. Pretty important lesson. We learned the vowels. We learned about how they're divided into groups. We talked about how they're pronounced. We then learned about quantity of vowels, and we learned the sounds of the 6 Latin vowels in both their long and short forms. It's time for you to study this lesson for yourself now and really master it. That's the work of a student. The work of a teacher is to prepare the material, present and explain the material to the students, and also be available to answer questions when students need help. But the student has to take initiative to study and make this content of this lesson your own. That's the work of a student, and you need to study this lesson for mastery. If you have any questions, post them on the course forum, and I'll give you detailed answers anytime you ask a question. But I don't think you'll have too much trouble with this lesson. Study it for mastery, complete the lesson assessments, and we'll move on in the study of Latin grammar. God bless.